There is a ship at the bottom of the North Atlantic Ocean. It has been there for over 100 years now, resting in the dark 2.5 miles below the surface, in water so cold and so still that time moves differently down there. Most people know its name before they know almost anything else about the sea, the Titanic. And most people, if you ask them, will tell you they know what happened. They've seen the film, they've read the articles, they learnt about it in school, maybe, a ship that was said to be unsinkable, a ship that struck an iceberg on its very first voyage, a ship that took more than 1,500 people down with it into the black water of the Atlantic. That is the story most of us carry. But there is another layer to this story. There always is, with things this large, this dramatic, this steeped in loss and money and power. And over the decades since that April night in 1912, a great many people have looked at the official account and asked quiet questions. Some of those questions are small, some of them are surprisingly reasonable, and some of them take you into stranger territory, into theories about insurance fraud, about secret societies, about deliberate sacrifice, about ships swapped in the night. None of those questions have been finally answered to everyone's satisfaction. And that is why we're here tonight. Over the next 2 hours or so, we're going to walk through everything. The established history first, what we know, what the records show, who was on board, and why it mattered. Then the theories, starting with the ones you've probably already heard, and moving gradually into the deeper, stranger corners of what people have believed and written and argued about for more than a century. We're not here to argue. We're not here to convince you of anything. We're here to explore, to walk through the strange museum of human suspicion and wonder and grief that has grown up around one ship and one night and one disaster that the world has never quite been able to let go of. Some of what you hear tonight will be grounded in real documents and real testimony. Some of it will be the product of grief or imagination or something in between. All of it is worth knowing, if only because it tells us something about ourselves, about how we make sense of tragedy, about how we look for meaning in catastrophe, about how we decide who to trust and who to doubt. The Titanic sank on the 15th of April, 1912. But in a quieter sense, it has never stopped sinking. Let's start at the beginning. To understand the theories, you first need to understand the world the Titanic was born into. The early 1900s were a time of extraordinary ambition. It is difficult to overstate just how quickly the world had changed in the decades leading up to the Titanic's construction. Within a single lifetime, people had gone from horse-drawn transport and candlelight to steel bridges, electric grids, and machines that could cross entire oceans without sails. Steam power had matured. Steel production had become faster and cheaper. Railways stitched continents together. Telegraph cables ran beneath oceans, allowing messages to travel faster than any ship ever could. There was a growing sense, especially among industrial nations, that progress was not only inevitable, but unstoppable. This belief was not abstract. It shaped how people thought about risk, about nature, and about limits. Nature, once seen as something vast and unpredictable, was increasingly viewed as something that could be measured, managed, and, in time, mastered. Into this atmosphere came the great ocean liners. Crossing the Atlantic had once been uncertain and often dangerous. Storms, mechanical failure, and navigation errors were constant threats. But by the early 20th century, passenger liners had become more reliable, more comfortable, and more frequent. What had once been a perilous journey was becoming, for some, almost routine. Still, there was competition. Two companies dominated the transatlantic route, the Cunard Line and the White Star Line. Cunard had built its reputation on speed. Its ships, like the Lusitania and the Mauretania, were designed to cross the Atlantic as quickly as possible, chasing prestigious speed records and national pride. White Star chose a different path. Rather than compete directly on speed, White Star focused on size, comfort, and experience. Their vision was not just to transport passengers, but to impress them. To create an environment so refined and so stable that the journey itself became part of the appeal. This was not a small distinction. It reflected two different philosophies about what progress meant. One emphasized efficiency and record-breaking performance. The other emphasized scale, luxury, and the idea that human engineering could create something not just functional, but magnificent. In 1907, during a dinner conversation that has since become part of maritime law, Bruce Ismay and William James Peary discussed how White Star could surpass its rival. The idea they settled on was ambitious, even by the standards of the time. They would build 3 ships unlike anything the world had seen: the Olympic, the Titanic, the Britannic. These ships would not aim to be the fastest. Instead, they would be the largest, the most comfortable, and, in many ways, the most impressive expressions of modern engineering ever put to sea. The scale alone was difficult for people to grasp. The Titanic, as the second of the 3, was designed to refine and expand upon what had been learned from the Olympic. Her length, 882 feet, meant that she stretched longer than many city blocks. Her height, from keel to top of the funnels, gave her a presence that dominated any harbour she entered. But it was not just her size, it was what she contained. First-class accommodations were designed to resemble the interiors of grand European estates. There were carved wood panels, sweeping staircases, chandeliers, and ornate furnishings. The famous grand staircase, with its glass dome overhead, became a symbol not just of the ship, but of the era's confidence in craftsmanship and design. There was a swimming pool, heated seawater circulating through it, a gymnasium equipped with some of the most modern exercise machines available at the time, a squash court, reading rooms, smoking lounges, private promenades. Even second-class passengers experienced a level of comfort that would have been considered luxurious on earlier ships. Third class, though more modest, was still significantly improved compared to previous standards. There were shared dining spaces, better ventilation, and more structured accommodations. The Titanic was not simply transporting people, it was organizing them into a floating reflection of society itself. At the top were the wealthy, traveling in private suites, dining on elaborate meals, and socializing in carefully designed spaces. Below them were professionals, families, and travelers of moderate means. And below them, in third class, were those seeking new beginnings, often leaving everything familiar behind. This layered structure mirrored the social hierarchy of the time. It was visible, physical, and, in many ways unquestioned, construction of the Titanic required thousands of workers. The Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast became a centre of intense activity. Steel plates were shaped and riveted together. Massive cranes moved components into place. The ship slowly took form over months, then years. For the workers, this was not just a job. It was participation in something historic. There were risks involved. Shipbuilding at that scale was dangerous. Injuries were common. Safety standards, by modern measures, were limited. Yet the sense of purpose was strong. They were building something that would be talked about, written about, and remembered. When the Titanic was launched in May of 1911, it was not yet complete. The hull entered the water, but much of the interior work remained. Over the next year, teams focused on fitting out the ship, installing engines, wiring electrical systems, and finishing the intricate interiors. By the spring of 1912, the Titanic was ready. Her maiden voyage was planned carefully. It would begin in Southampton, then stop at Cherbourg and Queenstown before heading across the Atlantic. This route allowed passengers from different parts of Europe to board, creating a diverse mix of travellers. The passenger list itself tells a story. Some boarded with trunks filled with fine clothing, jewellery, and personal staff. Others carried small bags, containing everything they owned. Some were travelling for leisure, others for business. Others still were chasing the idea of a different life, one that might exist across the ocean. The cargo reflected this diversity as well. There were letters and packages, part of the global communication network that connected continents. There were luxury goods and everyday items. There were objects that had clear destinations, and others whose significance would only become apparent later. The Titanic was, in many ways, a microcosm of the world. When the voyage began on the 10th of April, there was a sense of occasion. Crowds gathered to watch the departure. There was excitement, curiosity, and, for some, pride. The ship itself moved with a kind of quiet confidence. Its engines were powerful, but steady. Its design emphasized smoothness over speed. Passengers settled into routines, meals were served, conversations unfolded. The journey, at least initially, felt predictable. The stops at Cherbourg and Queenstown added more passengers, more stories, more movement. Then, by the 12th of April, the Titanic entered open water. Out there, away from land, the scale of the ship became even more apparent. Surrounded by the Atlantic, it seemed both immense and, at the same time, isolated. The weather during those days was calm. Unusually calm, according to multiple accounts. The sea was described as almost perfectly flat. This may sound like an advantage, but it had an unexpected consequence. In rougher seas, waves break against the base of icebergs, creating visible white foam. In calm conditions, that visual cue disappears. Icebergs become darker shapes against dark water, harder to distinguish, especially at night. The sky was clear, the air was cold, there was no moon on the night of the 14th. Throughout the voyage, the Titanic received ice warnings from other ships. This was standard practice. Wireless communication allowed ships to share information about conditions ahead. Messages would come in, be noted, and passed along. Captain Edward Smith was not inexperienced. He had spent decades at sea. He had commanded large ships before. He was nearing retirement, and this voyage was, in some ways, expected to be one of his final commands. He adjusted the course slightly south, following common procedure, but the ship maintained speed. This decision has been examined repeatedly. At the time, maintaining speed was not necessarily seen as reckless. It was common for ships to continue at near full speed unless conditions were visibly dangerous. Ice warnings were frequent in spring. Slowing down significantly was not always standard practice. Still, the combination of calm seas, darkness, and ice in the area created a situation that required precise observation. The lookouts in the crow's nest relied on their eyes. There were no binoculars available to them that night, reportedly due to a logistical oversight. This detail, small as it may seem, has been discussed extensively. At approximately 11:40 in the evening, Frederick Fleet saw the Iceberg. His response was immediate. The bell rang. The call went to the bridge. The officers reacted quickly. Orders were given. The ship began to turn. But the scale of the Titanic worked against it. A vessel that large cannot change direction instantly. Momentum carries it forward. The response, though swift, was not sufficient to avoid contact. The collision itself did not resemble a dramatic crash. It was subtle in some areas, more noticeable in others. Many passengers were unaware of its seriousness. Below the waterline, however, the damage was significant. The iceberg did not create a single large hole. Instead, it caused a series of openings along the hull. These openings allowed water to enter multiple compartments. The Titanic's design included watertight compartments intended to contain flooding. This was one of the features that contributed to its reputation for safety. But the design had limits. Water spilled from one compartment to the next as the ship's bow dipped lower. Thomas Andrews understood the implications almost immediately. His assessment was calm, but direct. The ship would not remain afloat. From that moment, the nature of the voyage changed completely. What had been a controlled, structured environment became something uncertain. Instructions had to be given. Decisions had to be made quickly. Passengers had to be informed, though not all at once, and not always with full clarity. The lifeboats became the focus. There were not enough of them. This was not an accident in the sense of oversight. Lifeboat regulations at the time were based on older standards, tied more to a ship's tonnage than its passenger capacity. The Titanic technically met those regulations, but the gap between regulation and reality became stark. Even under ideal conditions, there was not enough space, and the conditions were not ideal. Some lifeboats were launched partially filled, there was hesitation, confusion, and, in some cases, reluctance to leave the ship. The idea that the Titanic could sink was difficult for many to accept, even as the situation worsened. Time moved forward, the bow continued to lower, the angle of the deck changed, the cold became more noticeable. The reality of the situation became harder to ignore. Distress signals were sent, nearby ships received them. The Carpathia began moving toward the Titanic's position, but distance meant that help would not arrive immediately. In the final stages, the ship's structure was pushed beyond its limits. The breakup, when it came, was the result of stresses that the design had not been intended to withstand. The two sections descended separately, eventually coming to rest on the ocean floor far below. The loss of life was immense. More than 1,500 people did not survive. In the aftermath, there was a need to understand what had happened. Investigations were conducted. Testimonies were taken from survivors, crew members, and experts. The goal was to piece together a sequence of events, to identify causes, and, if possible, to prevent similar disasters in the future. The conclusions pointed to a combination of factors: speed in the presence of ice, insufficient lifeboats, communication issues, environmental conditions, human decisions made under uncertainty. No single cause explained everything. No single individual was held entirely responsible. And yet, for many people, the explanation felt incomplete. Not necessarily incorrect, but incomplete. Because the Titanic was not just a ship. It was a symbol. It represented an era's confidence, its assumptions, and its belief in progress. When it sank, it did more than cause a tragedy. It disrupted a narrative. And when narratives are disrupted, people begin to ask questions. Some of those questions are practical. Others move in a different direction. They look for patterns, for hidden motives, for details that do not quite fit. Over time, these questions would grow into something else. But for now, at this point in the story, what remains is the established account. A ship built at the height of industrial ambition. A voyage that began with confidence. A series of decisions and conditions that led, step by step, to a disaster. And a world left trying to understand how something so advanced, so carefully designed, and so widely believed to be safe, could fail in such a final way. That is the foundation. And from that foundation, the other stories begin to emerge. The famous theories. The insurance swap theory. This is, without question, the most widely discussed Titanic conspiracy theory. It is the one that returns again and again, resurfacing in books, documentaries, and quiet late-night conversations where the details are examined slowly, piece by piece. It is endured not because it is simple, but because it offers a kind of structure to the tragedy. A sense that what happened was not random, but planned. The claim, stated plainly, is this: the ship that sank in April of 1912 was not the Titanic. It was her sister ship, the Olympic. To understand why this idea took hold, it helps to look more closely at the Olympic herself. The Olympic was the first of the three sister ships to be completed. She entered service in 1911, nearly a year before the Titanic. At the time, she was celebrated in much the same way the Titanic would later be, as a triumph of engineering, a symbol of national pride, and a floating example of what modern industry could achieve. But her early career was not without problems. In September of 1911, just months after entering service, the Olympic was involved in a collision with Ms. Hawke, a British naval cruiser. The circumstances of the collision were complex, involving the hydrodynamic pull between two large vessels moving in close proximity. The result, however, was clear. The Olympic was badly damaged. Her hull was breached. One of her propeller shafts was bent. She required significant repairs, and she had to be taken out of service for an extended period. There was also the matter of blame. The subsequent inquiry ruled that the Olympic was at fault for the collision. This had financial consequences. Insurance claims that might have offset the cost of repairs were denied or reduced. The White Star Line was left to absorb much of the expense themselves. For a company already operating in a competitive and capital-intensive industry, this was not insignificant. According to proponents of the swap theory, this moment, the aftermath of the Hawke collision, is where the story truly begins. They argue that White Star now had a problem. The Olympic, their flagship, had been damaged and was no longer as pristine as before. Repairing her fully would be expensive. Returning her to service without addressing all issues might compromise her reputation. And at the same time, the Titanic, still under construction, represented a massive financial investment that would not begin generating revenue until her maiden voyage. 2 ships, one damaged, one new, and a company under pressure. The theory suggests that somewhere within this situation, a decision was made. The ships would be switched. The damaged Olympic would be repaired just enough to appear sound, then quietly rebranded as the Titanic. The real Titanic, newly built and in perfect condition, would be introduced into service as the Olympic. On paper, this might seem implausible, but proponents argue that the similarities between the ships made it possible. The Olympic and Titanic were nearly identical in design. They shared the same basic structure, the same dimensions, and many of the same internal layouts. To the casual observer, even to many experienced ones, distinguishing between them would not have been easy. Still, there were differences. And it is in these differences that supporters of the theory place much of their focus. One of the most frequently cited details involves the promenade deck windows. Early photographs of the Olympic show an open promenade deck with spaced columns. Later modifications enclosed parts of this deck with windows. The Titanic, as originally designed, had a slightly different arrangement. Proponents claim that photographs of the ship that sailed in April of 1912 show window patterns more consistent with the Olympic than with the Titanic's original plans. They point to specific images, enlarging small sections, comparing angles, counting window panes, and highlighting inconsistencies. In these comparisons, they argue, the visual evidence begins to suggest that something is not quite aligned. There are also claims related to portholes, the small circular windows along the hull. The number and arrangement of these portholes differed slightly between the two ships, particularly after modifications were made to the Olympic following her collision. Again, proponents assert that photographs of the Titanic reveal patterns that match the Olympic's configuration. Beyond visual details, there are logistical arguments. The Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast was responsible for both vessels. If any place had the capability to carry out such a switch, it would have been there. The ships were built side by side. Workers were familiar with both. Documentation could, in theory, be adjusted. The theory suggests that the switch would not have required altering every detail, only enough to ensure that the ship presented to the public as the Titanic appeared convincing. Names could be changed. Interior fittings could be adjusted. Records could be managed. It would not need to be perfect. It would only need to be sufficient. Then there is the matter of insurance. The Titanic was insured for approximately $12.5 million. This figure is often highlighted because it was slightly below the ship's total construction cost. In most cases, ships were insured at or near their full value. The difference here has been interpreted by some as an indication that the insurance arrangement was unusual. In the context of the swap theory, this detail takes on added significance. If the Olympic, already damaged and financially burdensome, were to be lost at sea under the identity of the Titanic, the insurance payout could help offset previous losses and stabilize the company's finances. But this leads to a crucial part of the theory. The sinking, according to proponents, was not meant to be catastrophic. It was meant to be controlled. The idea is that the ship would be deliberately placed in a situation where it would take on water gradually, while a nearby vessel stood ready to rescue passengers. The lifeboats, though insufficient for a full evacuation, would serve as temporary measures. The majority of passengers would be transferred safely. The ship would sink. The insurance claim would follow. A calculated loss, not a disaster. In this light, certain details are reinterpreted. The lifeboat shortage becomes less an oversight and more a sign of expectation. If a full evacuation were never intended, then full lifeboat capacity would not be necessary. The route and speed become part of a planned scenario rather than independent decisions. Even the presence of nearby ships, such as the Californian, is examined through this lens. Some proponents suggest that the Californian was intended to play a role in the rescue operation, positioned in advance as part of the plan. But something in this version of events went wrong. The iceberg collision was not part of the design, or, if it was, it unfolded differently than expected. The damage was more severe, the flooding more rapid, communication between ships less effective. The controlled scenario became uncontrollable, and the result was the tragedy as it is known. Another element that draws attention is the list of passengers who did not sail. J.P. Morgan, whose financial empire included the White Star Line, had booked passage on the Titanic, but cancelled shortly before departure. The reasons given at the time were related to business and personal matters. Still, the cancellation has been viewed with suspicion. Other prominent individuals also chose not to travel, though such changes in plans were not uncommon. Travel arrangements in that era were flexible, and cancellations occurred for many reasons. Yet, within the framework of the theory, these details are assembled into a pattern. The idea that certain powerful figures avoided the voyage lends weight, for some, to the notion that there was prior knowledge of risk. It is not presented as proof, but as something that feels, to those who believe it, difficult to ignore. And that feeling, that sense of something just beneath the surface, is a large part of why the theory has endured. It offers a narrative in which the disaster is not simply the result of misjudgment and circumstance, but of intention. It replaces randomness with design. It suggests that what happened was not an accident, but a plan that failed. At the same time, there are challenges to this theory that are equally substantial. A ship swap of this scale would require coordination across multiple levels. Shipyard workers would need to be involved. Engineers, inspectors, crew members, dock officials, clerks managing records, officers familiar with the vessels, passengers who had travelled on the Olympic before and might notice differences. The number of people who would need to either participate in or remain silent about such a plan is considerable, and yet no direct, verifiable confession has ever emerged. No document has been universally accepted as proof. No consistent chain of evidence has been established that confirms the switch beyond doubt. There are also technical considerations. The Titanic and Olympic, while similar, were not identical in every structural detail. Over time, modifications were made to both ships, creating subtle but real differences. Some researchers argue that these differences are visible in wreckage recovered from the ocean floor, aligning with the Titanic's known specifications rather than the Olympic's. Others counter that the modifications themselves blur the distinction, making definitive identification more complicated. The debate in this sense becomes ongoing. Photographs are examined, blueprints are studied, testimonies are revisited. Each piece of information is interpreted through a particular lens. For those inclined to see patterns of intention and concealment, the theory provides a framework that connects disparate details into a coherent story. For those inclined toward more conventional explanations, the same details appear as coincidences, misunderstandings, or the natural result of complex systems and imperfect record keeping. And between these perspectives, the theory continues to exist. Not resolved, not entirely dismissed, held in a kind of suspended state where it can be returned to, reconsidered, and reinterpreted. Because at its core, the insurance swap theory speaks to something larger than the Titanic itself. It speaks to trust, trust in institutions, trust in official accounts, trust in the idea that large systems operate transparently and predictably. When that trust is uncertain, theories like this find space to grow. They offer an alternative way of understanding events that feel too significant to be explained by ordinary means. Whether one finds the theory convincing or not, its persistence is, in itself, worth noting. It has become part of the broader story, a parallel narrative that runs alongside the established account, neither fully merging with it nor entirely separating from it. And for many, it is only the first step into a much deeper set of questions. But the insurance theory, compelling as it is really just the beginning of what people have questioned about that night, the J.P. Morgan and the Federal Reserve theory. There is a theory that connects the Titanic not to insurance fraud, but to something broader, quieter, and far more consequential in the long term. The creation of the United States Federal Reserve. To understand why this idea has taken hold, it helps to step briefly away from the Atlantic Ocean and into the financial atmosphere of the early 20th century. At that time, the United States did not have a central bank in the modern sense. There was no single institution responsible for stabilizing the banking system during crises, no coordinated mechanism for managing the money supply, and no lender of last resort to support banks facing sudden withdrawals. Instead, the system was fragmented. Banks operated independently. Trust companies, which were lightly regulated, held large amounts of deposits. Financial stability depended, to a significant degree, on confidence, and confidence could shift quickly. In 1907, that confidence did shift. A financial crisis, now known as the Panic of 1907, spread through the banking system. Depositors rushed to withdraw funds. Institutions that appeared stable suddenly faced collapse. The system, lacking a central coordinating authority, struggled to respond. Into this vacuum stepped J.P. Morgan. Morgan was not a government official. He was a private banker. But his influence was immense. In a series of meetings held in his library in New York, he and a small group of financiers organized a response. They assessed which institutions could be saved, which could not, and how to allocate resources to prevent a wider collapse. The crisis eventually subsided, but the experience left a lasting impression. It demonstrated both the vulnerability of the financial system and the unusual degree of power held by a small number of private individuals. For some observers, this was precisely the problem. A national economy, they argued, should not depend on the decisions of a single banker, no matter how capable. From this moment, the idea of a central bank gained renewed attention. Supporters believed that a centralized institution could provide stability. It could act during crises, manage liquidity, and reduce the likelihood of panic spreading unchecked. It could, in theory, make the financial system more resilient. Opponents saw something different. They viewed a central bank as a concentration of power. They worried that it would place control of the nation's money supply into the hands of a small group, potentially aligned with international banking interests. They feared that such an institution could prioritize financial elites over ordinary citizens. This debate was not quiet. It involved politicians, economists, bankers, and industrialists. It appeared in newspapers, speeches, and private correspondence. It was, in many ways, a reflection of a broader question. How much control should be centralized, and who should hold it? Within this context, certain individuals became associated, fairly or not, with opposition to the idea of a central bank. John Jacob Astor IV was one of the wealthiest men in the United States. His interests were varied, including real estate, technology, and finance. He was not primarily known as a political activist, but his economic independence placed him outside the circle of bankers who were actively shaping central banking proposals. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's, had served in Congress and was known for his views on economic policy. He had expressed skepticism towards certain forms of centralized financial control, though his position was nuanced, rather than absolute. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune, was part of a family deeply involved in industry and finance. Like Astor, he was not a leading public voice in the central banking debate, but he represented a class of wealthy industrialists whose interests did not always align with those of banking reformers. All three men boarded the Titanic. All three died when it sank. And in December of 1913, approximately 20 months later, the Federal Reserve Act was signed into law. These are the facts that form the foundation of the theory. From them, a narrative is constructed. According to proponents, J.P. Morgan stood to benefit from the creation of a central bank. He was deeply involved in financial reform discussions. He had the influence, the connections, and, in this telling, the motive to remove opposition. Morgan had also been scheduled to travel on the Titanic. He cancelled. The reasons given at the time were related to his health and business obligations. Reports suggested that he chose to remain in Europe for a longer period. This, in itself, was not unusual. Travel plans changed frequently, especially for individuals with complex schedules. But within the framework of the theory, the cancellation becomes significant. It is seen not as coincidence, but as foreknowledge. The narrative suggests that Morgan arranged for the ship's sinking in order to eliminate Astor, Straus, and Guggenheim, three men who, in this view, represented obstacles to the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. Their absence, the theory argues, removed key resistance at a critical moment, and with that resistance gone, the legislation could move forward. It is a striking idea. It connects a maritime disaster to financial legislation. It transforms a tragic event into a calculated act. It assigns intention to what is otherwise understood as a convergence of circumstances, and like many enduring theories, it draws strength from the alignment of timelines. The men were on the ship. They died. The law was passed the following year. The sequence is real. But sequences, by themselves, do not establish causation. This is where the theory becomes more complex. Historians who have studied the creation of the Federal Reserve describe a process that was extensive, contested, and multifaceted. It involved years of debate, drafts of legislation, political negotiation, and public discussion. The Panic of 1907 played a central role. So did subsequent studies and commissions, including the National Monetary Commission, which examined banking systems in Europe and proposed reforms for the United States. There were also many individuals involved. Supporters of central banking included politicians, economists, and bankers beyond J. P. Morgan. Opponents were similarly numerous, spanning different regions and industries. The debate did not hinge on a small number of voices. Even after the Titanic disaster, opposition to the Federal Reserve Act continued. The legislation faced criticism, revisions, and resistance as it moved through Congress. Its eventual passage reflected a combination of political conditions, economic concerns, and shifting public opinion. Within this broader context, the removal of three individuals, however prominent, does not fully account for the outcome. There is also the question of evidence. No document has been found that links J.P. Morgan to any plan involving the Titanic. No correspondence, no testimony, no verified record suggests coordination between the ship's voyage and the legislative process surrounding the Federal Reserve. Morgan's own role in financial reform was significant, but it was also public and, in many respects, collaborative. He was one of many figures engaged in shaping the future of the banking system. And yet, despite these counterpoints, the theory persists. Part of its endurance lies in its structure. It offers a clear motive. It identifies specific individuals. It aligns events in a way that feels purposeful. It transforms a complex historical process into a story with defined actors and outcomes. It also resonates with a broader pattern of thought. Large events, especially tragic ones, often invite explanations that go beyond randomness. When something feels too significant, too impactful, there is a tendency to search for intention behind it. The idea that 3 wealthy and influential men died at a moment when their absence could be seen as advantageous to others creates a narrative that is difficult to dismiss entirely, even when the evidence does not support it. There is also the figure of J.P. Morgan himself. He occupies a particular place in history, a symbol of financial power at a time when such power was both admired and feared. His involvement in the Panic of 1907, where he effectively coordinated a private response to a national crisis, reinforces the perception that he operated at a level beyond ordinary influence. In that light, it becomes easier for some to imagine that his reach extended even further, that he could shape not just markets, but events, that he could act not only in response to crises, but in their creation. Whether or not that perception reflects reality, it contributes to the theory's appeal. There are also smaller details that are sometimes included in the discussion. Other individuals who cancelled their passage. The presence of valuable artworks and items reportedly removed from the ship before departure. Accounts, often anecdotal, that suggest unusual circumstances surrounding the voyage. Each of these elements, taken individually, may have ordinary explanations, but within the theory, they are assembled into a larger pattern. A pattern that suggests preparation, a pattern that suggests knowledge, and, ultimately, a pattern that suggests intent. Of course, not everyone finds this convincing. Many see the theory as an example of how easily timelines can be arranged into narratives that feel meaningful but lack substantiation. They point out that history is filled with overlapping events, and that proximity in time does not necessarily imply connection. They also note that the Titanic carried many prominent individuals, and that focusing on 3 specific names can obscure the broader context of who was on board and why. Still, the theory remains part of the larger conversation. It is revisited, reinterpreted, and retold. It appears in discussions not because it has been proven, but because it raises questions that do not have simple answers. Questions about power, about influence, about how decisions are made and who benefits from them, and perhaps most importantly, about how people make sense of events that feel too significant to be left to chance. Because, at its core, this theory, like many others, is not only about the Titanic, it is about the search for meaning. It is about the instinct to look at a moment of loss and ask whether it could have been otherwise, whether someone, somewhere, knew more than they said, whether the story we have been told is the only one that exists, and whether, beneath the surface of history, there are currents that are not immediately visible, but still shape the course of events. Those are the 2 theories that most people have encountered. But the questions don't stop there. The mummy's curse theory. This one moves more quietly than the others. It does not rely on financial records or corporate decisions or legislative timelines. It belongs to an older category of explanation, one that existed long before steam engines and steel hulls. It is a story shaped less by documents and more by atmosphere. The claim is that the Titanic carried, somewhere within it, an ancient Egyptian artifact, and that this artifact carried something with it. Not weight, not value, but consequence. The object most often described is a painted wooden panel, said to be the lid of a mummy's coffin. Associated with a priestess from ancient Egypt, dated in some accounts to around 1350 before Christ. The details vary depending on who tells the story, but certain elements remain consistent. It was beautiful, it was old, and it was not, according to the story, at rest. In the late 19th century, there was a strong fascination in Britain and across Europe with ancient Egypt. Archaeological discoveries were being made at a steady pace. Tombs were opened, artifacts were transported, museums expanded their collections. Private collectors acquired pieces not just for study, but for display. Egypt, in the public imagination, became a place of mystery, not just historical mystery, but something deeper, something that felt preserved, sealed, and perhaps not entirely meant to be disturbed. Within that atmosphere, stories began to circulate. One of them concerned a particular artifact, sometimes referred to as the unlucky mummy. Despite the name, it was not a mummy at all, but a coffin lid or funerary board. It was intricately painted, depicting the figure of a woman, with stylized features and inscriptions. According to various accounts, the object had passed through several owners, and with each transfer, something unfortunate followed. A buyer who suffered financial ruin, another who experienced illness, a third who encountered unexplained accidents. The details shift depending on the version, but the pattern remains the same. Ownership was followed by misfortune. The object in this telling was not inert. It influenced events. Eventually, the artifact was said to have come into the possession of the British Museum, where it was catalogued and displayed. Visitors reportedly commented on its presence. Some described a sense of unease, others dismissed the idea entirely. But the story did not disappear. It evolved. And at some point, it became connected to the Titanic. In one version, the artifact was purchased by an American collector who arranged for it to be transported across the Atlantic. The Titanic, as the newest and most prestigious liner, became the chosen vessel. In another version, the object was not in the cargo hold, but in a first-class cabin, travelling under the supervision of a private owner. In yet another, it was not formally listed at all, but carried quietly, its presence known only to a few. The variations are numerous. What remains consistent is the placement of the object aboard the ship, and the implication that its presence mattered. One of the more frequently mentioned figures in this story is W.T. Stead. Stead was a journalist, editor, and public figure. He was known for his interest in spiritualism and the supernatural, topics that were widely discussed at the time. He had written about ghosts, about psychic phenomena, and about the possibility that the boundary between the living and the dead was more permeable than it appeared. He was also a passenger on the Titanic. And he did not survive. In some tellings of the mummy's curse theory, Stead is said to have known about the artifact. In some versions, he had even warned others about it. In others, he dismissed the danger, or treated it as a curiosity. There is no clear evidence that he made such statements about any artifact aboard the Titanic, but his known interests make the association feel, to some, plausible. It fits the tone of the story. A man interested in unseen forces, a ship carrying an object said to be connected to ancient rituals, a night in which the ordinary rules seem to fail. These elements combine easily. They create a narrative that feels coherent, even if it is not supported by documentation. Because when researchers examine the actual cargo records of the Titanic, they do not find clear confirmation of such an artifact. The manifests list a wide range of items, mail, textiles, machinery, personal effects, but nothing that can be definitively identified as an ancient Egyptian coffin lid of the type described in the story. And the artifact most often associated with the legend, the so-called unlucky mummy, has been traced to the British Museum, where records indicate it remained in England. It was not shipped across the Atlantic. It was not aboard the Titanic. From a historical and archival perspective, the conclusion is straightforward. The object, as described, was not on the ship. And yet, the story persists. Part of the reason lies in timing. The early 20th century was a period when interest in ancient Egypt intersected with a broader fascination with the supernatural. Seances, spirit photography, and psychic investigations were not fringe activities. They were discussed openly, attended by respected figures, and reported in newspapers. The idea that objects could carry influence, that they could retain something of their past, was not unusual. It was part of the cultural landscape. When the Titanic sank, it created a vacuum, a space in which explanations were sought. Some explanations focused on decisions, on engineering, on conditions at sea. Others moved in a different direction. They looked for something less tangible, something that could account for the scale of the loss without assigning it entirely to human action. A curse, in this sense, serves a particular function. It removes intention from individuals and places it elsewhere, not in a captain's decision, not in a company's policy, but in something older, something that began long before the ship was built. It suggests that the outcome was not entirely preventable, because it was not entirely within human control. There is also an aesthetic quality to the story. The Titanic is often described in terms of light, its interiors, its chandeliers, its polished wood and open spaces. It represents modernity, precision, and confidence. To place within it an object from an ancient world, something carved, painted, and associated with burial and ritual, creates a contrast that is difficult to ignore. Modernity and antiquity. Movement and stillness. A ship crossing the ocean, and an object that was meant to remain sealed. This contrast gives the story a kind of narrative symmetry. It feels complete in a way that purely factual accounts do not always feel. And that feeling can be persuasive. Even when the evidence does not support the claim, the structure of the story encourages it to be remembered. There are also smaller elements that contribute. Reports of strange occurrences during the voyage, though often anecdotal and inconsistent. The calmness of the sea, which in retrospect seems almost unnatural. The suddenness of the disaster, interrupting what had been a controlled and orderly environment. Each of these details can be interpreted in different ways. Within the framework of the curse theory, they become signs. Not proof, but suggestions. Indications that something was not as it appeared. Of course, from a more conventional perspective, these elements have explanations. The calm sea was a meteorological condition. The iceberg was part of a known pattern of ice movement in the North Atlantic. The sequence of events, while tragic, can be reconstructed through testimony and physical evidence. The absence of the artifact from cargo records is not a minor detail. It is a central point. And yet, the theory remains. It is told and retold. It appears in books, in documentaries, in conversations where the boundary between history and story becomes less distinct. Because ultimately, the mummy's curse theory is not sustained by documentation. It is sustained by imagination. It belongs to a tradition that predates the Titanic and continues long after it. A tradition in which objects carry stories, in which the past is not entirely separate from the present, in which certain events feel too large, too sudden, or too complete to be explained only by what can be measured. And so, the image lingers. A vast ship, lit against the darkness, passengers moving through its halls, unaware of what is to come. And somewhere, in a crate or a cabin, or simply in the story itself, an object from another time. Silent, unmoving, and, in some tellings, not entirely without influence. And from the mysterious, we move now to the more forensic, the coal fire theory. This one begins not with a secret meeting or a hidden artifact, but with something quieter, a fire. Not the kind that announces itself with flames and smoke visible from a distance, but the kind that burns slowly. Deep inside a ship, out of sight, inside the coal that feeds its engines. The claim is that the Titanic was already compromised before she ever entered open water. That within one of her coal bunkers, specifically Bunker 6, located along the starboard side of the ship, a fire had been smouldering for days, possibly weeks, and that this fire, though managed, was never fully extinguished before departure. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand how coal-fired ships operated. The Titanic carried thousands of tons of coal. This coal was stored in bunkers, large compartments located along the lower sections of the ship, adjacent to the boiler rooms. From these bunkers, coal was continuously fed into the furnaces that powered the engines. Coal, under certain conditions, can ignite spontaneously. When packed tightly, especially if it contains fine dust and is exposed to oxygen, heat can build within the pile. If that heat is not dissipated, it can reach the point of ignition. The result is not always an immediate blaze, but often a slow, persistent burn. These fires were not unknown. In fact, they were relatively common on steamships of the era. Crews were trained to deal with them. The typical method was not to extinguish the fire directly, which could be difficult, but to manage it. Burning coal would be removed and fed into the furnaces as quickly as possible. Adjacent areas would be monitored. The goal was control, not necessarily immediate elimination. Records from the Titanic confirm that such a fire existed. Testimony from surviving crew members, particularly stokers and engineers, indicates that a fire had been present in Bunker 6 prior to departure from Southampton. It was not considered unusual, but it was noted. The fire, according to these accounts, continued to burn as the ship began its voyage. It was worked on, it was managed, but it was not immediately put out. This is where the theory begins to take shape. In 2016, Senan Moloney presented an argument based in part on photographic evidence. He pointed to images taken of the Titanic before departure, noting a darkened area along the hull on the starboard side, roughly in the region of Bunker 6. According to Moloney, this discoloration corresponded to the location where the iceberg would later make contact. His suggestion was that the fire inside the bunker had heated the steel plating of the hull to the point where its structural integrity was reduced. Steel, when exposed to high temperatures for extended periods, can lose strength. It becomes more brittle, less able to withstand stress. If that were the case, then the iceberg did not strike a fully intact hull. It struck a weakened one. And that, the theory suggests, made a critical difference. Instead of resisting the impact, the compromised plates may have deformed or fractured more easily, allowing water to enter more rapidly and across a wider area than would otherwise have occurred. The damage in this interpretation was not solely the result of the iceberg. It was the result of an interaction between the iceberg and a pre-existing condition, a vulnerability that was already there. What makes this theory particularly compelling to some is that it does not require an elaborate conspiracy. There is no need for a secret plot to sink the ship, no need for coordinated deception across multiple organizations, only a decision to sail with a known issue. And that kind of decision is easier to imagine, because it fits within familiar patterns, schedules that must be kept, costs that must be controlled, risks that are acknowledged but judged to be manageable. Within this framework, the presence of the fire becomes more than a technical detail. It becomes a question. Who knew about it, and what did they decide to do? The stokers were aware. They worked directly with the coal. They would have seen the heat, the smoke, the areas where the fire was active. The engineers were aware. They oversaw the operation of the boilers and the management of the bunkers. Whether Captain Smith was fully informed is less certain. Some accounts suggest that he may have been told. Others indicate that such issues were handled at the engineering level unless they became severe. There is no clear record of a discussion about delaying the voyage, no documented meeting in which the fire was weighed against the schedule. But absence of documentation does not necessarily mean absence of awareness. It simply leaves space. Space for interpretation. Another detail sometimes noted is the behavior of the crew during the voyage. Some accounts suggest that the ship maintained a higher than expected speed, in part to consume coal more quickly. By burning through the affected bunker, the fire could be brought under control. This interpretation is debated. Maintaining speed was common practice, and there were multiple reasons for it, including schedule expectations and the general operating procedures of the time. Still, within the theory, it becomes part of a pattern. A ship with a fire. a need to manage that fire, a decision to continue rather than delay, and then an encounter with an iceberg in precisely the area where the fire had been located. There are, of course, counterpoints. Marine engineers and historians have examined the coal fire theory closely. Some argue that while the fire was real, its impact on the hull would have been limited. The steel plating of the Titanic was thick, and the temperatures required to significantly weaken it across a large area would need to be sustained and intense. Others note that the damage caused by the iceberg extended across multiple compartments, not just a single localized area. This suggests that the collision itself, rather than a pre-existing weakness, was the primary factor. There is also the question of the photographs. Interpreting early 20th century images is not straightforward. Lighting conditions, film quality, and angles can create variations in appearance. What appears as a dark mark may not correspond directly to structural damage or heat exposure. Still, the theory does not depend entirely on the photographs. It rests on a combination of known facts and inferred connections. A documented fire, a known location, a later impact in that same region, and a broader context in which decisions were made under pressure. It reframes the disaster in a subtle but significant way. Instead of a single moment, the collision, it becomes a sequence, a chain of events that began before the ship ever left port. It suggests that the sinking was not only about what happened on the night of April 14th, but about what was already in motion days earlier. And that idea carries weight, because it shifts responsibility, not entirely, but partially, from the unpredictable forces of nature to the choices made by people. Choices about risk, about timing, about whether a known problem was serious enough to justify delay. In this sense, the coal fire theory sits at an intersection. It is not purely a conspiracy in the sense of a hidden plot, but it does imply omission. It raises the possibility that something known was not emphasized, or not fully disclosed in the aftermath. That the official narrative, while not necessarily false, may not be complete. Whether that omission was intentional or simply a reflection of how such incidents were understood at the time, is a matter of interpretation. And like the other theories, it persists because it offers a different way of seeing the same event, a way that is grounded not in mystery or symbolism, but in mechanics, in heat, metal, and stress, in the idea that even the most advanced machine can carry within it a small, contained problem, and that under the right conditions, that problem can become part of something much larger, not the sole cause, but not irrelevant either, a quiet factor, burning, unseen, long before the iceberg came into view. The deep and fringe theories. The deliberate sacrifice of the third-class passengers. This is where the tone shifts, because this theory does not rely on hidden ships or secret financial plots or ancient objects carried quietly across the sea. It deals with something more immediate, something human, something that unfolded in real time, in corridors and stairwells and on decks where decisions were made in minutes. The claim is that the deaths of third-class passengers were not simply the result of confusion or unfortunate positioning within the ship, but that, in those critical hours, the structure of class was actively enforced, that access was controlled, and that, whether by instruction or by instinct, some lives were given priority over others. The numbers are often the starting point. They are simple and they are difficult to ignore. First-class passengers survived at a rate of roughly 60%, second class at around 44%, third class approximately 25%. These are not small differences. They form a gradient, a pattern that aligns almost too neatly with the social hierarchy of the time. At first glance, there are practical explanations. Third-class accommodations were located deep within the ship, toward the lower decks. Reaching the boat deck required navigating multiple levels, turning through corridors that were unfamiliar, and moving upward against the physical layout of the vessel itself. For many passengers, Especially those who had only boarded days earlier, the ship was a maze. There were also language barriers. Passengers in third class came from many different countries. Instructions, when they were given, were not always understood. Urgency, when it was communicated, did not always translate. And then there was time. The window between the collision and the point at which evacuation became critical was limited. Not all passengers were alerted at the same moment. Not all sections of the ship were equally informed. These factors alone can account for some of the disparity. But the theory does not stop there. It focuses on something more specific. Access the Titanic, like many ships of its time, had physical barriers separating different classes. Gates and partitions were installed not only to maintain order, but also to comply with immigration regulations. In particular, there were requirements designed to prevent the spread of disease, which meant that third-class passengers were, under normal conditions, kept separate from others. These gates existed. That is not disputed. The question is what happened to them after the collision. Some survivor accounts suggest that, in the early stages of the evacuation, certain gates remained closed. That movement from third-class areas toward the upper decks was delayed or restricted. The passengers attempting to move upward encountered barriers, both physical and procedural. There are descriptions of confusion, of groups waiting for permission to proceed, of crew members directing passengers in ways that did not always lead efficiently toward the lifeboats. Some testimonies go further. They describe gates being locked. They describe crew members preventing passage. They describe moments in which access to safety appeared to be controlled. These accounts are not uniform. They vary in detail, in clarity, and in reliability. Some were given immediately after the disaster. Others emerged later. Some contradict each other. Others align. The official inquiries examined these claims. The British inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, concluded that there was insufficient evidence to support the idea that third-class passengers were deliberately held back in a systematic way. It acknowledged confusion and delay, but did not find proof of intentional obstruction. The American inquiry, conducted by Senator William Alden Smith, took a slightly different tone. It raised concerns about how information was communicated and how passengers were guided. It suggested that the process was uneven and that not all groups were given equal opportunity to reach the lifeboats in a timely manner. Between these findings, a space remains, a space in which interpretation continues, because even without locked gates, the experience of passengers could still differ dramatically. A first-class passenger closer to the boat deck, more familiar with the layout, and more likely to receive clear instructions, would have a very different path than a third-class passenger navigating from below. Add to that the social norms of the time, deference to authority, assumptions about order, the expectation that instructions should be followed even when they are unclear, and the situation becomes more complex. There is also the question of priority. Women and children first was the guiding principle during the evacuation, but how that principle was applied could vary. In some cases, lifeboats were filled with first-class passengers simply because they were the first to arrive. In others, there were efforts to bring up passengers from lower decks, though not always successfully or consistently. The result was not a single coordinated system, but a series of local decisions. Decisions made by officers, by crew members, by individuals responding to the situation as they understood it. Within that environment, patterns can emerge, not necessarily because they were planned in advance, but because they reflect existing structures. The theory, at its strongest, does not require a formal order to sacrifice third-class passengers. It only requires that, in a moment of crisis, the existing hierarchy was maintained rather than set aside. That access to lifeboats was influenced, even indirectly, by class, that the pathways to survival were not equally available, and that this inequality had consequences measured in lives. This is why the theory resonates. because it does not feel distant. It does not depend on hidden documents or unlikely coincidences. It reflects something recognizable. The idea that, in moments of scarcity, resources are not distributed evenly. That proximity, knowledge, and status can shape outcomes. That systems built in calm conditions continue to operate, even when those conditions collapse. At the same time, there are those who caution against framing the event as a deliberate act of sacrifice. They point to the chaos of the situation, to the lack of clear communication, to the genuine efforts made by some crew members to guide passengers upward. They argue that what happened was not a coordinated decision, but a failure of coordination. A tragedy shaped by structure, but not by intent. And that distinction matters, because it separates two different kinds of responsibility. One is the responsibility of design, of how the ship was organized, of how access was structured before anything went wrong. The other is the responsibility of action, of what people chose to do in the moment, whether those actions were guided by fairness, by confusion, or by something else. The historical record does not resolve this completely. It provides fragments, voices, accounts that overlap and diverge. And from those fragments, different interpretations continue to form. What remains clear is the outcome, that the class structure of the ship did not disappear when the iceberg was struck. It remained. In the layout, in the movement of people, in the timing of access, and in the final numbers. It is not necessary to assume a deliberate plan to see that inequality played a role. The question is how direct that role was, and how consciously it was enforced. That is where the discussion continues, quietly, persistently, returning, again and again, to those same corridors, those same gates, and the decisions made around them in the early hours of a very cold morning. And then there are those who take the questions about that night considerably further, the Illuminati and secret society theory. This is where the story becomes less anchored to specific events and more expansive. It begins with familiar pieces, names, dates, decisions, but places them inside a much larger frame. A frame in which the Titanic is not an isolated, but a single moment in a long, deliberate sequence shaped by hidden hands. The claim, in its most coherent form, is that the sinking of the Titanic was orchestrated by a network of powerful individuals. The names used to describe this network vary. Sometimes it is called the Illuminati, sometimes the Freemasons, sometimes a more loosely defined group of international financiers and political actors. The exact label changes. The structure of the idea does not. There is, according to this theory, a group operating beyond public visibility, a group with long-term goals, particularly around control of financial systems, political influence, and global power structures. The Titanic, in this framework, becomes a tool, a carefully chosen event used to remove obstacles and move those goals forward. The elements that support this idea are not entirely new. They draw from the same details that appear in other theories. The presence of wealthy and influential passengers, the deaths of certain individuals, the absence of others, the connection, real or perceived, to the creation of the Federal Reserve. But here, those elements are not treated as isolated coincidences. They are treated as coordinated components, pieces of a plan that extends beyond a single company or a single decision. For example, the deaths of figures like John Jacob Astor, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim are interpreted not simply as tragic losses, but as targeted removals. Their influence, their independence, their potential opposition to centralized financial systems, all are seen as reasons they might have been selected. At the same time, the absence of individuals like J.P. Morgan is framed not as chance, but as intention. Presence and absence become signals, not proof on their own, but indicators within a larger pattern. From there, the theory expands. It suggests that the creation of the Federal Reserve was not merely a response to financial instability, but part of a longer project to centralize control over money and credit. A project that required not only legislation, but the removal of resistance, and the Titanic becomes one step in that process. There are also more symbolic elements introduced. In some versions, the date of the sinking, the night of April 14th into the early hours of April 15th, is examined through a numerological lens. Numbers are added, reduced, and interpreted. Patterns are drawn. Connections are suggested between the timing of the event and various symbolic systems. These interpretations vary widely. They are often complex and not always consistent with one another, but they serve a purpose within the theory. They reinforce the idea that nothing about the event was random, that even the timing carried meaning. Another detail sometimes discussed is the design of the ship itself. The Titanic had 4 funnels, but only 3 were functional. The 4th served primarily for ventilation and aesthetic balance. In some tellings, this detail is interpreted symbolically, associated with Masonic imagery or broader ideas about hidden structures, what is visible versus what is functional. This is where the theory begins to move further from verifiable evidence, because while the presence of 4 funnels is factual, the interpretation of that design as symbolic intent is not supported by contemporary documentation. Ship designers at Harland and Wolff described practical and aesthetic reasons for the configuration, consistent with other vessels of the time. Still, within the theory, such details are not dismissed. They are incorporated, seen as layers, additional signals embedded within the physical form of the ship. There is also the broader historical question of secret societies themselves. The Illuminati, as a historical organization, was founded in the late 18th century in Bavaria and was effectively dissolved within a few decades. Its documented activities do not extend into the 20th century. The Freemasons, on the other hand, were and remain a real organization, with members drawn from various professions and social classes. Many influential figures in the 19th and early 20th centuries were Freemasons. Their meetings, rituals, and networks were often private, which contributed to a perception of secrecy. But documented evidence does not link Masonic organizations to the planning or execution of the Titanic disaster. No records, no correspondence. No verified testimony establishes such a connection. And yet, the theory continues to circulate. Part of its persistence comes from its scale. It does not attempt to explain a single decision. It attempts to explain a system. It provides a framework in which disparate events, financial reforms, personal decisions, technological developments, and tragedies can be understood as connected. In that sense, it offers coherence, even if that coherence is constructed. There is also an emotional dimension. Large tragedies often create a sense of imbalance. The outcome feels too significant for the causes that are identified. An iceberg, a series of decisions, a set of conditions. These explanations can feel, to some, insufficient. They are accurate within the historical record, but they do not always satisfy the deeper question of why something so consequential happened. A theory involving a powerful, hidden group provides a different kind of answer. It suggests that the scale of the cause matches the scale of the effect, that something large happened because something equally large set it in motion. There is, in that idea, a kind of structure, and structure can feel reassuring, because it replaces randomness with intention. It replaces uncertainty with design. It suggests that events, even tragic ones, are part of a plan that can be understood, at least in outline. But that reassurance comes with a cost, because the evidence for such a coordinated plan, in the case of the Titanic, does not exist in any verifiable form. What exists instead are connections drawn across time, interpretations of symbols, and the alignment of events that can be arranged into a narrative that is compelling, but not demonstrable. And so, like many theories of this kind, it occupies a particular space, not fully within history, not entirely outside it. It is discussed, debated, expanded, and reinterpreted. It draws in elements from other theories, combining them into a larger whole. And in doing so, it becomes less about the Titanic itself and more about how people understand power, how they imagine it operates, how they interpret the actions of those who hold it, and how they respond when something happens that feels too large to be accidental. Because in the end, this theory is not only about a ship. It is about the idea that there are forces shaping events beyond what is visible. Forces that act quietly, deliberately, and, if one accepts the premise, effectively, whether those forces exist in the way the theory describes is another question. But the impulse to look for them, that remains. From the political and the occult, we move now to perhaps the strangest corner of Titanic theory, the premonition and prophecy theory. This one moves in a different direction. It does not begin with decisions made in boardrooms or actions taken on the night of the sinking. It begins earlier and in a quieter place, in imagination, in fiction, in the idea that sometimes a story appears before the event it seems to describe. In 1898, a writer named Morgan Robertson published a novella. It was called Futility. Later, it would be republished under a different title, The Wreck of the Titan. The story follows a ship, a very large ship, the largest ever built, according to the narrative. A vessel described as technologically advanced, powerful, and widely believed to be unsinkable. It carries wealthy passengers across the North Atlantic in the month of April, and during that voyage, it strikes an iceberg. The collision occurs at night. The damage is severe. The ship sinks, and because it does not carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board, many lives are lost. The fictional ship is called the Titan. When the Titanic sank 14 years later, readers began to notice the similarities. They are not subtle. Both ships are British. Both are described as the largest of their kind. Both are symbols of technological confidence. Both sail in April. Both cross the North Atlantic. Both strike icebergs on the starboard side. Both sink with significant loss of life due in part to insufficient lifeboats. Even the dimensions, while not identical, are close enough to invite attention. Robertson's Titan is described as around 800 feet long. The Titanic measures 882 feet. The Titan's displacement is given as larger than the Titanic's, but still within a comparable range for ships of that emerging class. Individually, each similarity might be explained. Together, they create a pattern that is difficult to ignore. After the Titanic disaster, Robertson's work was rediscovered and widely discussed. For many readers, the parallels felt uncanny. The idea that a fictional story had anticipated a real-world event with such specificity raised questions. Was it coincidence? Was it insight? Or was it something else? Robertson himself addressed these questions. He stated that he had not predicted the future, that he had simply observed the direction in which shipbuilding was moving. Ships were becoming larger, faster, more luxurious. The idea of an unsinkable vessel was already present in public discourse. The risks associated with icebergs in the North Atlantic were well known. From his perspective, the story was an extrapolation, a projection of existing trends taken to their logical conclusion. And within that explanation, there is a certain clarity. Writers often do this. They take the present and extend it forward. They imagine what might happen if current patterns continue. In that sense, futility can be understood as a product of its time. But for others, the explanation feels incomplete, because it does not fully account for the emotional impact of the similarities. The sense that the story and the event align not just in general terms, but in specific ways. And so, the idea of premonition enters the discussion. The suggestion that Robertson, consciously or not, accessed something beyond observation, that he perceived in some way, an event that had not yet occurred. This idea is not limited to Robertson. There is another figure often included in this theory, W.T. Stead. Stead was a journalist, editor, and public intellectual. He was also, notably, a passenger on the Titanic, and like Robertson, he had written about maritime disasters before the real one took place. In 1886, Stead published a piece describing a collision at sea. In it, he emphasized the consequences of insufficient lifeboats, presenting the scenario as a warning rather than a prediction. The message was clear. Ships needed to be better prepared. Lives depended on it. In 1892, he wrote another story involving a White Star vessel and a rescue at sea. Again, the themes of danger, response, and preparedness were present. These writings, taken together, form a kind of echo, not identical to the Titanic, but close enough to resonate after the fact. Stead himself was known to have an interest in spiritualism. He attended seances. He wrote about psychic phenomena. He engaged with ideas that suggested the boundary between the present and the unseen might not be as firm as it appeared. According to some accounts, though these are difficult to verify, he had been warned not to travel in April of 1912, that he ignored the warning, and that he boarded the Titanic anyway. Whether that detail is factual or part of the story that grew afterward is uncertain. But it fits. It fits the pattern that the theory constructs. A pattern in which the event is not isolated but foreshadowed, not sudden but anticipated. This is what gives the premonition theory its particular tone. It does not claim that the Titanic was sunk deliberately. It does not assign blame. Instead, it suggests that the event existed in some form before it happened, that it was imagined, written, described, as if the idea of such a ship carried within it the outline of its own ending. There is another way to look at this, a more grounded interpretation. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a time of rapid technological change. Ships were growing larger. Safety measures were evolving, but not always keeping pace with design ambitions. The risks of icebergs, of insufficient lifeboats, of overconfidence, these were real and discussed. Writers like Robertson and Stead were engaging with those realities. They were not predicting a specific event. They were exploring plausible scenarios, and when a real event later mirrored those scenarios, the similarities became more visible. This is a known pattern. When something happens, people look backward. They search for precedents, for hints, for moments that seem, in retrospect, to have pointed toward the outcome. And sometimes, those moments align in ways that feel meaningful, even if they were not intended as predictions. Still, the feeling remains, that sense of recognition, that quiet thought that something like this had been seen before, imagined before, written down somewhere years earlier. And that is why the theory endures, because it does not depend on proof, it depends on resonance, on the idea that certain events are not entirely new when they occur, that they exist first as possibilities, then as stories, and only later as reality. In that sense, the Titanic becomes more than a historical. It becomes part of a pattern, a moment where imagination and reality seem to overlap, even if only briefly. And whether that overlap is coincidence or something more is left, as it has been for more than a century, unresolved, the Californian and the mysterious ship theory. This is one of the quieter parts of the story. It does not begin with a bold claim, but with a series of observations. Lights on the horizon, signals in the night, a ship that did not move, and a question that has never been fully settled. On the night of April 14th into the early hours of April 15th, the SS Californian was stopped in the North Atlantic. Ice had formed around her, making forward movement risky. Her captain, Stanley Lord, made the decision to halt and wait for daylight. This in itself was not unusual. Navigating through an ice field at night carried real danger. Waiting was a cautious choice, a reasonable one under the circumstances. Earlier that evening, the Californian had sent a wireless message to nearby ships, including the Titanic warning of heavy ice in the area. The message was received, but it was not treated as urgent. The Titanic's wireless operators were busy transmitting passenger messages, and the warning did not immediately alter the ship's speed. Shortly after, the Californian's wireless operator went to bed. The radio fell silent. From that point forward, what happened depends on perspective. Crew members aboard the Californian reported seeing a ship on the horizon. It appeared relatively close. Its lights were visible. It did not seem to be moving quickly. At some point later, they saw rockets, white flares rising into the sky. They reported this to Captain Lord. He asked questions. What color were the rockets? How many had been seen? Whether the ship appeared to be signaling? The answers were uncertain. The crew attempted to communicate using a Morse lamp, a visual signaling device. They directed light toward the distant vessel, hoping for a response. None came. The rockets continued, and the Californian remained where it was. By morning, the situation had changed. The wireless operator returned to his post. Messages came through. The Titanic had sent distress calls during the night. The ship had sunk. The distance between the two vessels, estimated at somewhere between 10 and 20 miles, suddenly felt smaller. And the question emerged. Could the Californian have reached the Titanic in time? The official inquiries examined this closely. The British inquiry concluded that Captain Lord had failed to respond adequately to what should have been recognized as distress signals. The rockets, in maritime practice, were widely understood as indications of emergency. The decision not to act, not to wake the wireless operator, not to move the ship through the ice, was seen as a critical failure. Lord disagreed. For the rest of his life, he maintained that the situation had been unclear, that the ship he saw did not appear to be in distress, that the rockets were ambiguous, that the distance was greater than later estimated. He argued that he had not ignored a disaster. He had misinterpreted a situation. This disagreement remains part of the historical record. But layered over it is another question. Because some of the people aboard the Titanic reported something else. They saw a ship, not far away, closer than the Californian was believed to be, a set of lights on the horizon, visible during the sinking, a vessel that seemed within reach, close enough to offer hope. Some witnesses described it as stationary, others thought it was moving. At one point, according to several accounts, it appeared to be approaching. And then it turned and moved away. This ship was never conclusively identified. It appears in testimony. It is mentioned by survivors. It becomes, in the story, a presence, visible, real to those who saw it, and then gone. This is where the theory begins. One explanation is that the ship seen from the Titanic was, in fact, the Californian, but that distance and atmospheric conditions created the illusion of proximity. Light can behave in unusual ways over cold water at night. Refraction can make distant objects appear closer or distorted. In this interpretation, there is no third ship, only a misperception. The Californian was there, but farther away than it seemed, and unable or unwilling to respond in time. Another explanation introduces a second vessel, a ship that was not part of the official record of the disaster. One of the most frequently mentioned candidates is a Norwegian ship called the Samson. According to this theory, the Samson was in the area engaged in illegal sealing, hunting seals in waters where it was not permitted. If this were true, the crew would have had a strong incentive to avoid attention. Responding to distress rockets would mean identifying themselves, revealing their position, risking legal consequences. In this version of events, the Samson saw the rockets, recognized them, and chose not to respond. Instead, it turned away, leaving the scene. This account has been supported in part by later statements attributed to individuals connected to the Samson. But these statements are not universally accepted as reliable. The timeline, the location, and the details remain debated. Another interpretation ties the mysterious ship to broader conspiracy frameworks. In those versions, the unknown vessel is not accidental. It is intentional. a ship placed in the area as part of a plan to observe, to assist, or to intervene under specific conditions. Within the insurance swap theory, for example, the presence of a nearby ship is sometimes described as a necessary component. A rescue vessel, positioned in advance, ready to receive passengers in the event of a controlled sinking. If that plan existed, and if it failed, then the ship's departure, its movement away from the scene, becomes part of the story. Not confusion, not misinterpretation, but withdrawal. A decision to leave when the situation no longer matched expectations. There is no direct evidence to support this version, but it persists, because it fits within a larger narrative. A narrative in which multiple elements align toward a planned outcome. Between these explanations, misidentification, the Samson, or something more deliberate, the mystery remains. Because the testimony is real. People saw something. Lights in the distance. A ship that seemed close enough to matter. And in a moment, when help was desperately needed, that presence became something else. Not rescue, but absence. It is, in some ways, one of the most unsettling aspects of the Titanic story, not because it introduces something new, but because it sits so close to what is already known. A ship in distress, another ship nearby. Signals sent, signals seen. And no response that changed the outcome. Whether the mystery ship was ever truly separate from the Californian, or whether it existed as a distinct vessel that passed through the scene and left, is a question that has not been fully resolved, and it may never be, because the night itself offers limited clarity. Dark water, cold air, light travelling across distance, perception shaped by urgency and fear. In those conditions, certainty becomes difficult, and what remains are accounts, fragments, observations that align in some places and diverge in others, all pointing, in one way or another, to the same image. A ship in the darkness, close enough to be seen, far enough to be lost. That is the deep end of the pool. But before we leave the theories behind, there is one more thing worth considering. The suppressed survivor testimonies theory. This theory shifts the focus forward in time, away from the iceberg, away from the night itself, and toward what happened after the survivors reached land, when the story of the Titanic began to be written, recorded, and, in some cases, shaped. The claim is not that the disaster was staged, or that the sinking itself was hidden. It is something quieter, that the record we have, the version of events that became widely accepted, may not include everything that was said, that some voices were emphasized, and others less so. The Titanic produced a vast amount of testimony. Passengers spoke to reporters almost immediately after being rescued. Crew members gave statements. Formal inquiries were held in both the United States and Britain. Hundreds of individuals were questioned. Thousands of pages of transcripts were generated. It was, in many ways, one of the most documented disasters of its time. And yet, documentation is not the same as completeness. The American inquiry began first, led by Senator William Alden Smith. It took testimony from a wide range of survivors, including passengers and crew. It moved quickly, sometimes very quickly, in an effort to capture accounts while memories were still fresh. The British inquiry followed, chaired by Lord Mersey. It was more structured, more formal, and, according to many critics, more controlled in its scope. This is where the discussion begins. Lord Mersey was an experienced legal figure. He was also perceived, both at the time and in later analysis, as sympathetic to the interests of British shipping companies. This perception influenced how the inquiry was received. Critics argued that the questioning focused heavily on certain areas, particularly the speed of the ship and the actions of senior officers, while giving less attention to broader systemic issues. Issues like corporate decision-making, safety regulations, and the lived experiences of passengers in different parts of the ship. Within this framework, the idea of selective emphasis emerges. not necessarily a deliberate effort to hide the truth, but a tendency to prioritize certain narratives over others. For example, the testimony of high-ranking officers was given significant weight. Their accounts helped establish the sequence of events, the decisions made on the bridge, and the technical aspects of the sinking. These were in many ways essential, but they were not the only perspectives available. There were also stokers and firemen, men who worked deep within the ship, in the boiler rooms and coal bunkers. Their experience of the voyage was different. They were aware of conditions that passengers never saw: the heat, the mechanical strain, the state of the ship's internal systems. Some of these men gave testimony that suggested a more complicated picture: descriptions of the coal fire, accounts of how it was managed, observations about the ship's condition in the days before the collision. These details were recorded, but they did not always become central to the final conclusions. Similarly, there were accounts from third-class passengers, stories of movement through the ship, of delays, of confusion, of barriers encountered while trying to reach the upper decks. Some of these accounts included references to gates, to restricted access, to moments where movement was not as free as it might have been. These testimonies were not entirely ignored, but they were not pursued with the same intensity as other lines of inquiry. They remained, in many cases, at the edges of the official narrative. This is where interpretation begins. One view is that this reflects the practical limits of any large investigation. Time is limited. Attention is finite. Investigators must decide which questions to follow and which to leave aside. In that process, some details inevitably receive more focus than others. Another view is that the pattern reflects something more structured, a preference for explanations that are contained, that attribute the disaster to a set of identifiable factors: speed, ice, visibility, rather than to broader systemic issues that might implicate institutions. In this reading, the inquiries did not fabricate evidence. They selected from it. They shaped a narrative that was clear, manageable, and perhaps less disruptive. There is also the matter of language and accessibility. Many third-class passengers did not speak English as their first language. Some spoke very little of it. Giving testimony in such circumstances is difficult. Nuance can be lost. Details can be simplified. Translators were used in some cases, but not always consistently. This creates another layer of filtering. Not intentional suppression, but a form of reduction. Complex experiences translated into simpler statements, and sometimes not translated at all. Over time, as the story of the Titanic was retold in books, films, and documentaries, these patterns continued. Certain accounts became well known, others remained obscure, not because they were hidden, but because they were not repeated. The narrative stabilized around a set of familiar elements: the iceberg, the speed, the lifeboats, the band playing on deck. These are powerful images. They are also selective. The theory of suppressed testimonies suggests that if one were to step back from the established narrative and look again at the full range of accounts, including those less frequently cited, a more complex picture would emerge. Not necessarily a different conclusion, but a more layered one. One in which multiple factors interact, in which the experiences of different groups are given equal weight, and in which the disaster is understood not just as a sequence of events, but as a system under strain. There is some support for this approach among historians. Modern research has revisited original transcripts, personal letters, and lesser-known accounts. In doing so, it has added depth to the understanding of what happened, not by overturning the established narrative, but by expanding it. At the same time, there is no clear evidence of a coordinated effort to suppress large portions of testimony. No directive. No document indicating that certain voices were intentionally excluded. What exists instead is a pattern that can be read in different ways: as limitation, as bias, or as something more deliberate. And that ambiguity is what allows the theory to persist, because it does not rely on a single hidden fact. It relies on a question. How complete is the story we have, and whose voices shaped it? In the end, the Titanic left behind more than wreckage. It left behind words, thousands of them, spoken, written, recorded, and remembered. Some of those words became central, others remained at the edges. And even now, more than a century later, the process of listening to them, of assembling them into a fuller picture, is not entirely finished. The counterpoint layer. What mainstream history says. The mainstream historical account of the Titanic disaster is, at its core, a story about the consequences of overconfidence and inadequate regulation. From this perspective, the ship was not secretly flawed or deliberately compromised. It was built using the best knowledge and materials available at the time. The steel, while later shown to become brittle in very cold temperatures, met the standards of the early 20th century. The rivets, some of which contained higher levels of impurities, were consistent with industrial practices of the era. These details matter, but not in the way conspiracy theories often frame them. They are not evidence of hidden sabotage. They are evidence of limits. Limits in metallurgy. Limits in testing. Limits in understanding how materials behave under extreme conditions. The people who designed and constructed the Titanic were working at the edge of what was known, not ignoring something obvious. The same applies to the ship's safety features. The watertight compartments were considered advanced. The idea that a ship could remain afloat with multiple compartments flooded was a significant innovation. But the design did not account for a scenario in which water would spill from one compartment to the next in a cascading sequence. Again, this was not negligence in the modern sense. It was a boundary that had not yet been encountered. The issue of lifeboats follows a similar pattern. The Titanic carried enough lifeboats to meet, and in fact exceed, the legal requirements of the time. Those regulations, however, were outdated. They were based on older, smaller ships and had not been updated to reflect the increasing scale of modern liners. This created a gap, not between what was required and what was provided, but between what was required and what was actually necessary. That gap only became fully visible after the disaster. The question of speed, often central in both official inquiries and later discussions, is also viewed differently in this framework. Captain Smith did not act outside accepted norms. Maintaining near full speed in the presence of ice warnings was common practice. It reflected a broader confidence in navigation, in ship design, and in the ability of experienced crews to respond to hazards as they appeared. That confidence, in retrospect, appears misplaced, but at the time it was widely shared. From the mainstream perspective, the disaster was not caused by a single decision or a single flaw. It was the result of multiple factors aligning: environmental conditions, technological limits, human judgment shaped by prevailing assumptions, and a regulatory system that had not yet adapted to the scale of modern engineering. No hidden plan is required to explain the outcome, only a recognition that systems can function normally and still fail when pushed beyond their limits. The Titanic, in this view, was not an exception. It was the moment when those limits became impossible to ignore. The insurance swap counterarguments. The insurance swap theory, despite its specificity and emotional logic, faces several significant challenges when examined closely. The most immediate is the problem of scale. A ship is not a small object that can be quietly altered without notice. It is the product of thousands of hands. At Harland and Wolff, large teams worked on both the Olympic and the Titanic over extended periods. These workers were not interchangeable observers. They installed specific components, worked on particular sections, and became familiar with the details of each vessel. Even small differences would have been noticeable to those who built them. For a swap to occur, either those workers would need to be involved in the deception, or the changes would need to be subtle enough to escape attention entirely. Both possibilities raise difficulties. Coordinating silence across such a large workforce, over time, without any credible disclosure, becomes increasingly unlikely. There is also the matter of inspection. Before carrying passengers, ships like the Titanic were subject to review by the Board of Trade. Inspectors examined safety features, documentation, and the general condition of the vessel. These inspections were not casual. They were procedural and recorded. For the swap theory to hold, these inspectors would either have to fail to notice discrepancies between the ships or be part of the arrangement. Neither scenario is supported by documentary evidence. And the number of individuals involved in such inspections further increases the scale problem. Then there is the financial logic. The insurance payout for the Titanic was approximately $12.5 million. This figure is often presented as a motive, but when compared to the actual cost of building the ship, it becomes less compelling. The payout did not exceed the construction cost. It did not represent a large profit. Instead, it would have covered only part of the investment, while also destroying a brand new flagship vessel and risking reputational damage on a global scale. For a company like the White Star Line, the long-term consequences of such a loss, in public trust, in bookings, in corporate standing, would likely outweigh any short-term financial recovery. There is also the photographic evidence. Robin Gardner's analysis focuses on window configurations and other visual differences between the Olympic and Titanic. These details are real, but their interpretation is not universally accepted. Early 20th century photographs are often limited in clarity. Angles, lighting, and later modifications to ships can complicate direct comparisons. Maritime historians who have studied both vessels extensively have not reached a consensus supporting the swap claim. In many cases, the differences cited can be explained by known alterations or by the limitations of the images themselves. Finally, there is the wreck. Since the discovery of the Titanic on the ocean floor, researchers have examined structural features that correspond with original plans and documentation. These findings align with the identity of the ship as the Titanic, rather than the Olympic. Taken together, these counter-arguments do not simply challenge individual details of the theory, they challenge its overall feasibility. Not by dismissing the idea outright, but by asking whether the number of assumptions required about people, processes, and silence can reasonably be sustained. The Federal Reserve counter-arguments. The Federal Reserve theory has an appealing simplicity, but it depends on a version of history that compresses a long and complicated process into a single, decisive moment. The roles of the three men most often cited, John Jacob Astor, Isidor Straus, and Benjamin Guggenheim, are less clear-cut than the theory suggests. Astor was undeniably wealthy and influential, but his direct involvement in the technical debate over central banking is not strongly documented. His interests were broad, and while he moved in financial circles, he was not a central figure in shaping monetary policy. Strauss, similarly, was a prominent businessman and former congressman, but his primary identity was as a retailer. His views on economic issues existed, but he was not a leading voice in the specific legislative effort that produced the Federal Reserve Act. Guggenheim, while connected to a powerful industrial family, was even further removed from the policy-making process. In other words, while all three men were important in their own domains, none can be clearly identified as indispensable opponents whose absence would decisively alter the outcome of national legislation. More broadly, the passage of the Federal Reserve Act in December of 1913 was the result of sustained political effort. President Woodrow Wilson made banking reform a central goal of his administration. His party held significant influence in Congress. Committees studied the issue. Drafts of the legislation were debated, revised, and negotiated over time. Support for a central banking system had been building since the Panic of 1907. Opposition did not disappear after the Titanic sank. Critics of the Federal Reserve continued to speak, write, and organize. The debate remained active. The eventual passage of the Act reflected political alignment and momentum, not the sudden absence of a few individuals. This is an important distinction. It suggests that the outcome was driven by structural factors, economic conditions, political leadership, and institutional priorities, rather than by the removal of specific opponents. Then there is J.P. Morgan. His cancellation of passage on the Titanic is well documented. But it is not unique. Many passengers altered their plans in the days before departure. Travel in that era was flexible, and changes were common. Morgan's health provides a straightforward explanation. At 64, he was dealing with ongoing medical issues and was known to adjust his schedule accordingly. He remained in Europe for a longer period, reportedly for rest and treatment. He died the following year. To interpret his cancellation as evidence of foreknowledge requires an additional step, one that is not supported by direct evidence. It requires assuming that the cancellation was not routine, but intentional in a specific and concealed way. And that assumption is not corroborated by contemporary records. Taken together, these counterarguments do not deny that the Titanic carried influential individuals, or that its sinking occurred in proximity to important financial developments. They do, however, challenge the idea that those elements are causally linked. They suggest that what appears, at first glance, to be a clean narrative, event leading directly to outcome, becomes more diffuse when placed within the broader historical context. A context in which many forces were already in motion and in which the loss of even prominent individuals did not determine the course of policy on its own, where even conspiracy researchers disagree. It is worth noting that the world of Titanic research is not unified. Even among those who believe the official account leaves gaps, there is no single alternative explanation that commands broad agreement. Instead, there are multiple interpretations, often built from the same fragments of evidence but arranged in very different ways. The insurance swap theory and the Federal Reserve theory are a clear example of this divergence. One suggests a financial fraud centered on ships, insurance, and corporate survival. The other suggests a political and economic motive tied to banking reform and the removal of influential figures. Both cannot be fully true at the same time, because they depend on different intentions, different planning, and different outcomes. The coal fire theory sits apart from both. It does not require secrecy on a large scale. It does not depend on hidden actors or long-term plotting. It offers a mechanical explanation, one that could exist entirely within the accepted framework of events, while still altering how responsibility is understood. The mystery ship theory overlaps with several others, but does not rely on any single one. For some, it is evidence of missed rescue. For others, it becomes a supporting detail in larger narratives involving planning or coordination. The same observation, a ship seen in the distance, is interpreted in multiple ways, depending on the framework applied. This pattern repeats across the field. Details such as lifeboat numbers, passenger movements, wireless messages, and timelines are examined and re-examined. Different researchers emphasize different elements. Some focus on technical inconsistencies, others on human decisions, others still on broader historical context. What emerges is not a single competing story, but a collection of them. And that has implications. Because when multiple theories attempt to explain the same event, but do so in incompatible ways, it suggests that the underlying evidence does not point clearly in one direction. Instead, it allows for multiple interpretations, each highlighting certain aspects while downplaying others. This does not mean the questions are invalid. Many of them are grounded in real observations. Discrepancies in testimony, gaps in documentation, decisions that remain difficult to fully explain. These are legitimate areas of inquiry, but the narratives built around them often go further than the evidence can firmly support. They extend from what is known into what is possible, and in doing so, they begin to diverge from one another. The Titanic disaster left behind a vast record, but it also left absences, moments that were not recorded, voices that were not fully captured, details that were lost, misremembered, or never written down. In that space, between what is documented and what is not, interpretation becomes inevitable. And over more than a century, that space has been filled many times over, not with a single answer, but with many. The open questions. We've travelled a long way tonight, through the documented facts and the financial theories and the strange borderlands where prophecy and coincidence meet. And now, as things begin to slow, what remains is not a final answer, but a set of questions. Not sharp, urgent questions, quieter ones. The kind that stay with a story long after the details have settled. The first is this: who or what was the mystery ship? It appears again and again in testimony. Lights on the horizon. Seen from the bridge, seen from the deck, seen by people who understood what they were looking at. This was not a rumour passed between passengers. It was an observation made in the middle of a crisis, by individuals trained to read the sea. Some described it as close, closer than the Californian was later believed to be. A presence that felt reachable, a ship that, for a moment, seemed like the answer to everything that was unfolding. And then, nothing. No response to rockets. No change in position that altered the outcome. No confirmed identity. The explanations exist, but they do not settle comfortably. Perhaps it was the Californian, seen through unusual atmospheric conditions that distorted distance. Perhaps it was another vessel, like the Samson, with reasons of its own for remaining silent. Perhaps it was something simpler still, a combination of light, distance, and perception, creating an image that felt more solid than it was. But none of these explanations fully close the question. Because the experience of seeing that ship, of believing, even briefly, that help was near, remains part of the story. And it does not resolve easily. The second question concerns the gates. Not just whether they were locked, but what they represent. The Titanic was built with divisions, not only in its layout, but in its assumptions. Who moved where? Who had access to which spaces? Who was expected to stay within certain boundaries? These divisions were normal. They were part of the design. But when the situation changed, when the ship shifted from order to emergency, those divisions did not simply disappear. They had to be navigated. And for some, that navigation was not straightforward. The testimonies vary. Some describe open passage. Others describe delay. Some speak of guidance. Others of confusion, of being held, of not knowing where to go or whether they were allowed to go there. It is possible that no single uniform policy existed, that some gates were opened quickly, others later, that some crew members acted decisively, others hesitated. But even within that variability, the outcome remains. A sharp difference in survival, a pattern that aligns with class. And the question is, not only whether barriers were locked, it is whether the structure of the ship, physical and social, made it harder for some to reach safety, and whether that difficulty was recognized, addressed, or simply unfolded as the situation intensified. The third question turns back to Captain Smith. He is, in many ways, a quiet figure in the story, respected, experienced, near the end of a long career. In the official account, he is neither villain nor hero in any exaggerated sense. He is a man who made a decision to maintain speed within the norms of his time, and then faced the consequences of that decision with composure. But there are gaps, not accusations, but uncertainties. How did he weigh the ice warnings? How clearly were they communicated to him? And how did he interpret them? What did he know about the coal fire, if anything? Was it simply another routine issue, or something that carried more weight? These are not questions that can be answered directly, because Smith did not survive. His perspective is reconstructed from the accounts of others, from what was seen, what was remembered, what was inferred. And in that reconstruction, there is always a degree of distance, a space between what was and what can be known. The fourth question rests deeper. In the cargo hold, most of what the Titanic carried was ordinary. Mail, commercial goods, personal belongings, items moving from one place to another as they always had. But the hold was vast, and the records, while detailed, are not always complete in the way modern documentation might be. There are references to items that are not fully traced, mentions in testimony that do not appear clearly in manifests, stories that attach themselves to objects, whether accurately or not, and persist. It is easy, perhaps, to let the imagination fill that space, to place something unusual there, something significant. But even without that, the question remains in a simpler form. Do we know everything that was carried, or only most things? And what does it mean in a story like this to not know entirely? The fifth question concerns something smaller, almost invisible. The rivets. Thousands of them held the Titanic together. They fastened the steel plates of the hull. They were not glamorous. They were not the focus of attention when the ship was launched. But they mattered. Decades after the sinking, when pieces of the wreck were examined, it became clear that not all rivets were identical. Some contained higher levels of impurities, some were more brittle, some may have failed under stress more readily than others. This does not suggest sabotage, it suggests variation. The kind that occurs in large-scale manufacturing, especially in an era when quality control was different from what it is now. But even variation invites questions. Were these rivets chosen because they were available, because they were cheaper, because of supply constraints, or simply because they met the standards of the time? Even if those standards were not as precise as we might expect today, the answers are not entirely clear, and so the rivets remain part of the conversation. A reminder that even small components can matter when everything else is under strain. And then there is the sixth question, the quietest one. Not about what happened, but about how it is remembered. When people speak about the Titanic, certain names appear quickly. Astor, Guggenheim, Ismay, these names carry weight. They are repeated. They become anchors for the story. But the majority of those on board were not widely known. They were families, workers, passengers travelling with little more than what they could carry, crew members who kept the ship running, stokers who worked in heat and darkness, stewards who moved through corridors that others rarely saw. When the ship sank, many of these people were lost, and with them their accounts. What remains are fragments, lists of names, ages, nationalities, occasional testimonies from those who survived. But the story that is most often told is shaped by those whose voices were heard first and recorded most clearly. Those who spoke the language of the inquiries, those whose accounts were published, repeated, and preserved. This is not unusual. It is how history often works. But it raises a question. If the story had been built differently, if the center of it had been elsewhere, what would feel different? What details would stand out? What would we notice more clearly? Perhaps the layout of the lower decks, the experience of moving through them, the timing of information, the texture of those final hours seen from a different position. This is not a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered. It is a shift in perspective, a recognition that what we remember is shaped not only by what happened, but by whose voices carried forward. And that shaping continues, even now. What we do know is this. The Titanic sank in the early hours of April 15th, 1912. More than 1,500 people did not survive. The ship rests on the ocean floor, in two main sections, separated by distance, but connected by what remains of a single event. Around that event, stories have formed, some grounded in documentation, some in interpretation, some in imagination. All of them attempts, in one way or another, to understand. Because there is something about the Titanic that resists being left alone. It was too large, too confident, too carefully constructed, and its end feels even now like a contradiction. That something so solid could disappear. That something so planned could fail. And so the questions remain. Not all of them urgent, not all of them answerable, but present, moving quietly beneath the surface of the story. The iceberg did not know the Titanic's name. The ocean did not recognize its design. The night did not adjust itself to human expectation. And yet, more than a century later, the event continues to be examined, reconsidered, and retold. Not because it can be solved completely, but because it cannot. And perhaps that is part of what keeps it here. Not just as history, but as something closer to a memory. One that returns slowly each time someone looks at it again, and wonders not only what happened, but whether everything that could be known has already been said, or whether some small part of the story is still, quietly, waiting. Tonight we travelled through some of the strangest and most persistent ideas that people have attached to one ship and one night. We moved slowly through a world that felt certain of itself. A world that believed it had reached a kind of summit that steel and design and human planning had. If not conquered nature, then at least brought it within reach. And then we followed that certainty out into the open water. We stood at the beginning of the voyage, where everything was still intact, where the ship was complete, the decks were full, and the future, for everyone on board, still stretched forward in ordinary ways. And we stayed with the questions that came afterward, not just the official ones, but the quieter ones, the ones that return again and again, not because they are proven, but because they are possible. The idea that the ship was not what it seemed, that the people on board were not there by chance, that something ancient moved quietly in the background, that something mechanical, small and contained, grew into something larger, that some people were given time and others were not. That help was closer than it appeared. That voices were heard and others were not carried as far. Each of these ideas, in its own way, tries to adjust the shape of the story, not always to change the facts, but to change the meaning, because meaning is the part that does not settle easily. The facts, over time, become stable. Dates, names, measurements, but meaning remains fluid. It moves depending on where you stand, on what you notice, on what you feel is missing. And so the Titanic becomes something more than an event. It becomes a surface, something people return to again and again to look for reflections of power, of inequality, of risk, of human limits, of the thin boundary between control and collapse. And over time, the ship itself has changed, not in the way it is remembered, but in the way it exists. It rests now far below the reach of light, 2 miles down in a place where pressure replaces air and where time moves differently. The structure is no longer what it was. Edges soften. Surfaces break down. The iron itself is slowly being consumed by organisms that did not exist in human awareness when the ship was built. Rust forms in long, delicate shapes. Sections collapse. Spaces that were once filled with movement and sound are now still. And this process continues, quietly, without interruption. There is no moment when the ship disappears, only a gradual change, a slow return. And yet, as the physical object fades, the story does not. If anything, it becomes more defined, retold, reframed, passed from one generation to the next, not as a fixed account, but as something that invites attention, because it contains so many layers. A technological achievement, a human tragedy, a social structure made visible under pressure, a sequence of decisions that seemed ordinary at the time, and a result that, even now, feels difficult to fully accept. More than 1,500 people entered the water that night. The temperature was such that survival, for most, was measured in minutes. The lifeboats, once lowered, moved away. Those inside them listened, not to explanations, but to sounds, voices, calls, and then gradually less of them, until there was only the water again. Those moments are part of the story too, not always described in detail, not always easy to hold in mind, but present and central. Because beyond every theory, every interpretation, every question about what might have been different, there is that reality. People were there. They experienced something final. And that cannot be rearranged. What can be rearranged is how we think about it, how we place it, whether we see it as an accident shaped by conditions and limitations, or as something that invites deeper suspicion, or as a mixture of both. That choice, in many ways, belongs to the listener, not as a test, but as a reflection of how we understand the world, of whether we are more comfortable with randomness or intention, with systems or individuals, with explanation or uncertainty. And perhaps the reason the Titanic endures is that it does not force a single answer. It allows for all of these ways of seeing. It holds them quietly without resolving them. Tonight, as the story comes to rest, the ship remains where it has always been. The water above it is still. The currents move slowly. The darkness is complete. Above that, the surface continues. Ships pass. Weather changes. The world, in all its complexity, continues to move forward. And beneath it, the outline of something that once carried so much intention remains, gradually becoming part of the environment around it, not gone, but changing. And here, on the surface, the questions remain. Not urgent, not demanding, just present. You can return to them or not. You can hold them lightly or let them drift. Because not every question needs an answer to have value. Some are simply a way of staying with a story a little longer, of acknowledging that something happened and that it matters, and that, even after more than a century, it has not fully settled into silence. For now, though, it is enough to let it be where it is, to let the water remain still, to let the questions rest where they have come to rest. There will always be time to return. Another night. Another quiet hour. For now, just let the story fade gently and rest.